a lot. A lot are on Zoom, but there's a lot here. The purpose of this series of workshops is for us to receive staff advice and additional information to enable us to provide guidance to staff ahead of the Audit New Zealand process and the final LTP adoption in June. I'll now hand over to staff. Hello, Peter. And Pete as well. Welcome.
Ata Maria, Mayor, Major and councillors. So look, the process here, and Peter will lead us through over the next couple of weeks, this week and into next week, we have a bit of a process to go through where we'll set out the thematic summary of the submissions, the alignment between the staff survey, the resident survey and the LTP key performance indicators, and then we will also work through the financials, and then lastly the staff advice of what has come out of the consultation document and emerged through the consultation process. So there's quite a lot of information over the next wee while to share with you and for Q&A to occur, but I will hand over to Peter Ryan to give more detail on that.
Hi everyone, welcome. Look, as you know, we've had a record amount of interest in this LTP, 7,000 submissions, which is over double the previous record. This morning we'll be setting the scene for you prior to going into the discussions around the LTP itself. The first one is the alignment between the resident survey and the levels of service in the draft LTP. That came from originally a question from Councillor McDonald, but was supported by the rest of the council, that we would pause and take stock of what the residents were telling us and whether our draft LTP was correctly aligned with that. It turns out to be a good question, because while many of them were aligned, there is some recalibration that has been triggered by that. So Adelaine Hansen, who's a performance analyst with my team, will be up shortly to step you through that. After that, you all know Amy Martin from my team, who will take you through the analysis of submissions. Now, obviously, with the volume we've had and the complexity of those 7,000, it is difficult for any individual to read through all of that content and understand all the relationships between them. What Amy's done is crunch that for you into themes so that it's easy to see the main ideas that are coming through from our community and what they might mean for the LTP. Basically, whenever we approach an LTP, the idea is to go in with the idea that we have listened and that informs the discussion being made. And of course, lastly, the financial update. Russell Holden and Bruce Moe will be here to step you through any changes to our financial position or the rates since the draft, which was February. It seems like a long time ago. So that's set the scene. I think at that point, unless there are any questions, we might move to the resident survey results section of the morning. So, Adelaine.
Thanks. Kia ora. So, as Peter mentioned, this report was a response to one of the questions asked when the resident survey was presented. It was about whether, now that we had the results, the LTP activity planning was still aligned. So we looked at about 15 activities that were in the resident survey, 38 satisfaction measures, and then looked at the activity plans at services, level of service statements, other relevant performance measures, associated budgets from historic and future. And then we went out to the heads of to say, based upon this information presented to you in the report, do you still feel that what you have done is, in terms of resident surveys and measures, are they still appropriate? And is the LTP planning also appropriate as a response? At a high level, what we have found was that the majority of the activities confirmed the targets, so that's 10 out of 15. And 5 activities were recommending some change to the performance measures, and that was about 6 performance measures or targets overall. They're relatively minor. So for citizen customer services, it was about removing something that they thought was duplication. The 3 water swans were about lifting the targets a bit, in communications and engagement was just improving some wording and considering the environment in which they were working in. And this is all outlined in the report in a lot of detail. But as a whole, they feel like all the activities and heads of these activities that we looked at feel that the LTP planning is aligned and sufficient to meet their future targets, either as adopted in the draft LTP or as they now have recommended. And then these changes are going to be put through in an appendix or in the LTP draft adoption, and that's how then they will be adopted, assuming that everything is cool.
Thanks, Adelaide.
Okay. Yep. I'll do Sarah, then Yanni.
Thanks. I don't know if we wait to the next bit, but the level of service change that's proposed based on the resident survey thing for the resident satisfaction with water supply. So that looks like it's going up. Is that right? We had proposed in the long-term plan to reduce that level of service down to 60. So if we are going to change the level of service target, will we be specifically looking at increasing the resource available to meet the target? Noting that we had planned to change the target down from 65 to 60 because there weren't enough resources to meet the target.
So depending on specifically which one, when we spoke to the Three Waters team about the specific ones that they wanted changed, so there's only specific ones that they want to change, they were often due to either some work that had already been done that they were expecting those gains to be seen, because certain operational things were now becoming coming in place.
Yeah.
Some of the other changes had to do would just strengthen, like they were already like on track or based upon how the historic data was. So that was proposed to them. So the targets were then supposed to be raised.
But one of them on the resident satisfaction with water supply was actually going to be decreased down from 65 to 60. And I'll read the rationale that council staff gave in the long-term plans. This is on page 42 of the long-term plan. Is that with a council-led reduction in the capital program for renewing ageing infrastructure, as funding only focuses on comparing renewal rates to depreciation rates, upcoming bow waves of large, purely age-related renewals coinciding, it is expected that maintenance resource will become stretched due to more frequent bursts due to sweating assets. It is surmised that this will lead to a reduction in resident satisfaction. And I mean, there's only 2 times that the word sweating appears in our long-term plan, and they're both to do with our water supply.
Yeah, Brent will be able to answer you.
Yeah.
Councillor, we've got a presentation, maybe on Friday, I believe, on the water supply and the state of the asset and all those things that you've talked about and the rationale behind it. So,
Yeah.
is it this Friday, Peter?
I think it is
What's
Friday
the time?
Friday morning.
Friday morning. So we've done quite a comprehensive presentation on all of those things that you just talked about. So it should answer your questions.
I'm just concerned because the long-term plan document says it was a council-led reduction on this, and yet when I was asking before we signed off the draft how much it would cost to increase or to decrease the leaks and things, the staff response and the staff advice was that we had put on an appropriate amount.
Yep, and we've done some more work on that since then, and we'll explain it on Friday as to exactly where we're at and what potential implications of if you wanted to double the efforts. But you'll see from the data that we've got that we're on track as to where we wanted to be. But there's a lot of detail in the presentation. I would just ask if you wait till Friday to have a look.
It's probably worth just mentioning that the same staff who have provided this recommendation are the staff who wrote those comments.
Yeah, but
but they're informed by the latest result.
Yeah.
So what they've obviously done is taken stock of what the community is saying now,
Yeah.
looked at their resourcing and planning, as Brent has said, and have come to the conclusion that recalibration is appropriate. I'm not sure that we can really explore that at a technical level, and that maybe the workshop that Brent's talking about is the one.
Yeah.
that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah. And just in terms of the ones that we adjusted up, we felt that we'd been achieving those quite easily for a couple of years, so that's why we've sort of given ourselves
Yeah,
some
yeah.
stretch targets, which is a good thing. So,
Yeah.
but we'll explore that other one on Friday.
Wonderful. Yanni, please, then Victoria.
Yeah, can you give me a sense of what the changes are in citizens and customer service and comms and engagement?
Yes, so, apologies. For citizen customer services, just one specific one that is proposed to be deleted. It's a level of service related to the citizen's customer satisfaction with the quality of service received for email contact. So that one is proposed to be removed because there is a different measure in place already that's about citizen and customer expectations for service response are delivered in a timely manner for email inquiries.
Right.
And one of the other reason that one is proposed to be deleted is the head of service reviewed the reasons for satisfaction, and the aspects that need improvement relate to email service requests and responsiveness with individual business units. So not just, it doesn't just sit with customer citizen and customer service, so they will respond in a timely manner, and then if the request is something that they cannot close off right away, they will then forward it onwards. But sometimes when they ask the survey, no matter how clear they try to be, please only focus on this aspect, it gets flavored by.
So I guess I was hoping that because the residents' survey was so damning on some of these things, that we would be given options for improving. So we're still waiting, for example, on, and maybe it's comms and engagement, or I don't know what category it comes under, but people having input into council decision making. And so we were told that there's work being done to look at what improvements we can make, but I don't have any sense of what we're doing. In fact, what I know is we're doing less consultation on some things, even though the resident survey is saying people actually want to be involved more.
Sorry, just to be clear, this is about a measure around response times for emails, response quality to emails. So the issues you raised, relevant, but completely separate issue.
Okay, so I understand that, but because we don't see what the actual things are in here, I'm just trying to understand in terms of the areas that we have seen that are bad in the resident survey. Isn't that what we were told, that this review was focused on what we could do in the LTP to address the ones that we're failing or struggling with?
This particular review was to check whether or not the LTP was aligned with the residents' survey. So based upon results, whether current targets and plans were still relevant. So that is what we looked at based upon existing information. The data has gone to heads of service to review.
So just so I'm clear, this is like a sort of technical review to remove things that are no longer fit for purpose because of the feedback we're getting in the resident survey. This isn't about making improvements to the things that people are dissatisfied with so that we can get a better level of response.
That's correct. Councillor McDonald's question specifically was, can we look at the latest results and determine whether they are aligned with where we have set levels of service around the survey? So that if, for example, we are at 80%, why would the level of service goal be 60%? So is that level of alignment?
Okay.
Whether the issues that you're referring to have been adequately addressed in the draft LTP is a wider question.
So when is that information going to come back to us about what we're doing in terms of the F&P improvements or the F&P performance targets not being met and the improvements that are being made in terms of the LTP? Is there another process to do that?
I'm not aware of one. That was the purpose of the activity plan process.
The flag, I think that's a gap and we need to have some thought around that.
Thank you. Victoria, please.
Well, thanks, Mayor Phil. I'm not sure if this is time to raise it now because we don't have the comms and engagement staff in the room, but I've got some concerns around changing the performance measures and targets in relation to comms and engagement. With lowering that target, my gut on it, my first read of it last night was that it's just almost accepting mediocrity. I'm really concerned about lowering the target because we're not meeting it, and I don't see that as a reason to be doing that. I think we should be concentrating our efforts on how we can do things differently, because doing what we've always done is always going to get the same results. What is the process then for us to to discuss whether we're actually going to accept these recommendations or not. Is now the time to do that, or where are we going with that?
These changes or proposed changes will come back to you in the draft LTP report. So that would be one mechanism for doing so. But before we get to that, we could come back to you with further information just to tease out what the issues are. It is a summary report you're seeing here.
Yeah, there's a couple of paragraphs on it saying that I think it's more realistic and that it doesn't reflect any change in their commitment. But I'd really like to be able to talk to the comms and engagement staff about that, because it's not sitting very well with me.
So I'm going to propose that we either meet with you or come back to you with some more detail, and that the formal mechanism would be the LTP report, where, as Adelaide said, this will be an attachment and it's either supported or not.
Thank you. Good hope. Anyone? No?
Oh no, cool. I'm just aligning with
You're just
Councillor Hentox.
nodding in agreement. Okay. Thank you very much. No more questions?
Thank you.
Carry
Thanks,
on.
Adelaide.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next one is Amy Martin's thematic analysis. So this is an attempt to give you a structured breakdown of what the 7,000 plus submissions and hearings have told us. There's quite a bit of detail in here, but I mean, this is arguably the largest community consultation exercise in the city, and it is for a 10 billion plus plan and budget. So teasing these issues apart is very relevant to what we're doing here. So I'll hand over to Amy to step you through it.
Good morning. All right, into the thematic for this year. So, as Peter said, we've had a record number of submissions, and we'll get into the numbers a little bit more in a second, but just a good opportunity to stop and remind you that the thematic doesn't cover everything that submitters said. It pulls out those big themes and delves into those a little bit more, and there's the supporting document that you got yesterday, which covers what I'm about to talk about today in more detail again. So it doesn't cover everything, it's just based on those big things. So, who did we hear from? In total, and we only got to this final number last week, we got 7,040 submissions, and that translated, as we were coding, into 48,690 individual submission points. So it was a lot of content to work through. You heard from 300 submitters during the hearings, and we received several pro forma submissions on some key issues. Those are the Arts Centre, Arana Park, the Sports Field Network Plan, and the School Strike for Climate submissions. In terms of who the submissions came from, 96% of them were from organisations, from individuals, 4% were from organisations, and then we had about 0.1 that were just anonymous submissions. In terms of how submitters submitted, the bulk there you can see came through the online forms, so that was 95%. 3% were the email, 1% or 48 were via post, and then 110 or 2% over the counter, and the comms team tell me that that is a fraction of the number that we printed. So somewhere out there in the world is a whole bunch of forms that we printed that have gone somewhere. And then 4 were just in that other category. In terms of the split across the city, so we've broken it down here by community board and ward. You can see that there is a large chunk up the front there that is not stated, and as you're probably aware, the Arts Centre ran a fairly organised campaign that didn't require submitters to give us their address, so we do have a big chunk this year. We don't know where they come from, and that's that 4,300 that you can see there, which equates to around 61% of the total submitters. Banks Peninsula was around 3% of the total. Waitai Coastal Burwood Linwood was 6%. Waipuna, Hallsville Hornby Riccarton was around 6%. Fendleton, Waimari Harewood, and Papanui Inner Central around 7%. And then Spread Cashmere Heathcote hit around 9%. So I think those in terms of the overall percent of submissions, they probably look a bit lower this year than you would expect from each of the boards and the wards, but in terms of the actual numbers, they're a lot higher than we had last year. So it is that big not stated chunk that is driving those proportions down. So when you're looking at those, it's just good to keep in mind that actually the numbers are still pretty good by the ward and community board, but there is a huge chunk and we just don't know where they're from. We do know, though, that at least 5% of submissions that we received were from people who don't live in Christchurch. So you've got the full list there, which breaks it down, but there was quite a few from our neighbours, so 118 from people in the Selwyn district, 89 from Waimakariri, and then the numbers decrease a little bit. Auckland, 37 submissions from people living in Auckland, and then a few from overseas this year, which is particularly unusual. So a lot of those were driven by the Arts Centre and Orana Park, but yeah, we've had a broad reach geographically for this LTP. And so I'll move into some of the key demographics, but just before we do, just a reminder around why we collect this demographic information. And one of the biggest reasons is to understand who we have heard from and who we haven't heard from. We're in a space now where we're collecting it consistently across both our engagement and research programs, and we keep the questions consistent with how it's collected via the census, which enables us to benchmark against the city. So, who did we hear from? I barely updated the colours on this from last year, so the good news is it didn't get any worse, and the bad news is it didn't necessarily get any better. We're still very low in that under 18 year age group there. You can see 44, 18 to 24 years, we're a bit better in terms of overall numbers, but still the percentage of submitters didn't change particularly much. 25 to 34 years, again, we've got some reasonably good numbers there, and then you can see they increase dramatically in terms of the numbers as we get to 35 years and over. On the ethnicity side, again, it hasn't changed very much from last year. So where we have information on submitters' ethnicity, 41% of submitters reported being of New Zealand European ethnicity, 3% Māori, 1% for Pacific, and then 2% for Asian. And then we've got Mila and other European at the bottom there. Again, like with the wards, the proportions haven't changed terribly much, but in terms of the actual overall numbers, they are up a little bit. So in terms of overall representativeness, not much change, but the numbers are much bigger than they have been in the past in some of those areas, which is positive. Okay, into what submitters told us. So we asked a big range of questions in the CD this year, and from here what we'll run through focuses around those questions. The first one was, have we got the balance right? And 37% of submitters thought that we should accelerate work on some projects and programs that we aren't at the moment. 35 thought that we should explore other ways to bring down our proposed rates increase. 20% were happy for us to just deliver what we'd proposed in the draft LTP. So have we got the balance right? From the written feedback, the short answer is almost. And I think what is important to understand is submitters weren't asking for big wholesale change. They were asking for changes in usually very specific areas. And the important thing to remember is the balance looks different for everyone. So, and we say it all the time, one person's nice to have is another person's must have. And we really saw that reflected in the submissions this year. So our residents and communities have a range of different views, opinions and priorities, and they told us all about them in their submissions. On one hand, we had, and you can see it reflected in the graph there, submitters who voiced the opinion that we hadn't gone far enough to reduce costs and that rates increases were too high and we hadn't exercised the financial restraint that they would expect from us. And then on the other hand, we had submitters who expressed a strong desire to see us doing more to prepare the city for the future and asking us to accelerate and prioritise some work programs. So it's almost the tale of two halves for this LTP. In terms of our rates proposal, we asked another specific question on this, and you can see the response on the right. Have we got? Should we be maintaining our existing levels of service and level of investment in our infrastructure and facilities? And 51% of submitters told us that yes, we should. 32% told us no, and then you can see there's 16% in there who didn't know. In terms of the ones who said yes, the importance of maintaining those levels of service and the things that they provide for the city and residents was clear, and they told us that quite clearly in their submissions. And then on the other hand, we had a group who are saying that households are financially challenged and they're facing increasing financial pressure, and they have concerns around affordability and fairness. So again, you can see that what came through in the balance side of things also came through in our rates proposal. And then essentially the argument boils down to a desire for us to be preparing for the future in the LTP and building in things that will help the city thrive both now and in the future, versus a concern about cost of living and the affordability of living in Christchurch now. So can I afford to live in Christchurch? Can I afford to stay in my home? And can I afford to pay my rates? And that came through from a few submitters in the hearings as well that came to speak to you. At the bottom there, submitters aged between 35 to 64 years old were more likely to tell us that we shouldn't be maintaining our services. Where it gets interesting is that those under 35 years and those above 65 years were more likely to agree that we should be maintaining them. So that's really important for those younger submitters, and under 35 years, you've got your young families starting to come in there, and those young people living in Christchurch, but also over 65 years agreeing that we should be maintaining them. And we got a lot of feedback on the libraries and how important the libraries are and how many people value their service. So you can see the things starting to creep in there with the age breakdowns as well. Onto our levels of service. So this was a big theme throughout submissions across a range of topics and issues and services that we provide. And what they really said is our community values the services that we provide, and they contribute to making Christchurch the kind of city that residents want to live in. So they told us that they're important. They told us that they are places that facilitate community and connection and provide places to meet or gather. And a lot of submitters told us that they were pleased to see we hadn't cut services to reduce rates, and they would rather pay a bit more to protect those services that they really value. In some instances, they said that reducing services would be a false economy because the ones that it would impact the most are the most vulnerable in our communities who couldn't afford to access them elsewhere. And then, on the other hand, as I've said, you had your submitters who thought we should be doing everything we can to reduce costs and reduce the rates increase, even if that did mean cutting services. And there was a lot of talk around sticking to the basics and reducing unnecessary costs, but there wasn't a lot of consensus around what the basics actually are. So that is something that we hear every year, and every year it is not clear what are the basics. There is very little consensus on that. Yes, and what matters most. Changes to how we rate. So there was a few proposals. These are the main two that we got submissions on. The city vacant differential, so we were proposing to extend that into areas such as Linwood Village and New Brighton, Sydenham, and then commercial Banks Peninsula zoned land in Littleton. 53% of submitters supported this and have basically told us that they think it's a good way to move forward. 3% opposed, so a very small amount, and then you've got 39% there who provided other suggestions. And a lot of the other suggestions fundamentally supported the use of the city vacant differential, but they actually wanted us to go further than we were proposing to. So those who supported and many of those who provided the other suggestions thought that it was a good way to encourage productive use of land across the city and discourage land banking. And the other suggestions that most commonly came up were that we extend it to cover the whole city, and we increase the multiplier from 4.523 to 6. And there was, in some instances, feedback from submitters as well that suggested that we should be providing remissions to car parks at all for the city vacant differential. On the other hand, you had the few in there who didn't agree with extending it, and we've heard this before as well on the city vacant differential. They think that it's overly punitive and or a revenue gathering exercise as opposed to a genuine mechanism to encourage behaviour change. In terms of rating visitor accommodation as a business, again, good support for that. 77% of the submitters who provided feedback supported, 7 opposed, and 10% provided other suggestions. And the general feedback was that if they're operating as a business, then they should be charged as a business. And in some instances, submitters raised the impacts that Airbnbs in the city are having on the rental market and what's available for residents in that market, and think that this will help to ease some of that pressure. And then on the other hand, again, we had the submitters who felt that it was heavy-handed and unfair and had concerns that it would have impacts on visitor accommodation and tourists visiting the city. Fees and charges. So the main one that we got feedback on in terms of fees and charges was the proposal around car parking at Hagley Park. So 1,088 submitters provided feedback on that. 30% supported it as it was, 43% opposed, and 19% provided alternative ideas or solutions. Those who supported it generally advocated for a move towards a more user pays approach, and we saw that feedback on a few things that we got submissions on in the LTP, and acknowledged the need to manage demand. Many of those who opposed did so hesitantly and did so hesitantly and asked us to make sure that when we implement this, we implement it in a way that doesn't prohibit access and that there's still fair and equitable access for everyone in the city to those gardens and parks. Those who opposed felt that access would be unfairly impacted, so that was their main concern, and they told us that our green spaces should be freely available to for everyone to use, and that the biggest impact would be on those who can least afford to pay for the parking. So it wasn't we object and oppose to having to pay for parking. It was concerns around access that drove most of that opposition. In terms of the other ideas, submitters put forward quite a lot of other ideas, including keeping the weekends free so that, yes, we charge during the week to manage that demand, but the weekends are free and everyone can still go and use it. Implementing a first hour free and then charging for time stayed after that, or keeping the parking fees low enough that they're affordable for most. So it really does come down to managing that access and ensuring that everyone can use those facilities, which comes back to the levels of service feedback that we got around these are the things that people value in Christchurch, and they are what makes them enjoy living in the city. So there's some connections the whole way through. Disposal of council-owned properties. The overarching message on both of these proposals was essentially get on with it. If it makes sense to get rid of them, if we don't need them anymore, then get rid of them. Those who opposed tended to oppose generally disposing of council-owned land and assets, so they didn't want to see us selling things that we could use later. And there was some instances people felt that we should be retaining these properties to help build the tree canopy to further that urban forest work, so that came up quite a lot in submissions. In terms of the 5 properties that we asked about, the sale at Waipara Street was a concern for some, who view that as a potential future link between Craycroft and a shared path across the Cashmere Stream. So in terms of those 5 properties, that was the only one that really came up a number of times that people were saying, please don't sell that one. Overall, 57% of submitters supported moving forward with those 5 properties. In terms of the disposal of other council-owned properties, including the former Port Hills Red Zone, the message was much the same, get on with it. And many see this as a way of reducing financial pressure and easing some of the pressure on the council, which should, in theory, flow through to easing pressure on ratepayers as well. So of the 1,128 submitters who addressed this one, 58% supported moving forward with the process. There was some submitters on this one who had concerns about selling red zone land and told us that they would like to see it offered back to the owners, and if it was sold, then the history of the earthquakes and the displacement of those people who lived there acknowledged in some way. Others wanted to see it sold with conditions around how it was used, including environmental protection and community consultation, and there was some advocating for ecological reserves or green spaces for that land as well. Okay, before I get on to our proposed spending, I just want to, I've thrown this up here because I think this really does underpin the feedback that we heard on our proposed spending, and that is that one person's nice to have is another person's must have. And as I said at the start, a lot of the feedback on a lot of the issues really was a tale of two halves. So as I work through that, I think it's important just to keep this in mind, that there is two sides to the story in almost every case, and submitters weren't often 100% united on what they were asking for. So our operational spending, we ask submitters if we are prioritising the right things, and of the 2,295 submitters who provided feedback, 35% agreed that we've got it about right, and 39% thought that we needed to make some change. In this one, the written feedback really enforced that they were pleased to see us maintaining our levels of service again. And as with the levels of service, others told us to look for ways to cut costs. In some instances, they asked us to do that in ways that won't have an impact on levels of service. So leave the levels of service alone and look for some other methods of reducing costs. A smaller cohort has suggested that we should be looking at cutting services to reduce costs, and in a number of cases told us that there are certain aspects of our spending that they feel are wasteful, or in some instances they just generally told us that our spending was wasteful. And that sentiment was again echoed by those who opposed our proposed operational spend. Generally, submitters over the age of 35 were more likely to tell us that we aren't prioritising the right things. So 44% versus 33% there. And much of the feedback on that operational spending came down to community grants and funding. We received a lot of feedback on community grants and funding in this LTP, and I think you probably saw that in the hearings and the people who came to speak to you as well. A lot of that focused around that community grants and funding side of things, and they were really reminding us of the importance of the grants and funding that we provide, the work that it enables across the city, and the likely cost and resourcing implications if we had to take on a lot of that work ourselves. So particularly in the hearings, they talked about the grants and funding we provide and the support that they support thousands of volunteer hours provided by people in our community every year. So there are people out there doing that volunteer work, and those grants and funding support that work. Submitters reminded us of the wide-reaching economic benefits that some of these grants and funding foster, and I think the Screen Canterbury grant is a good example of that one, where they actually said, you gave us this much and we think that it had this much economic benefit for the city. And many of them feel that the return from them is much greater than the investment from the council, and in many cases that return can't be monetised, but that is the things that they are providing are valuable. So the main ones for grants and funding were obviously the Arts Centre, around a park, the Biodiversity and Sustainability grants, and the Screen Canterbury grant. And we'll run through a few of those now. The Arts Centre. So there was 4,158 submissions on the Arts Centre. About half of those came from the form that the Arts Centre set up and ran themselves, and 99% of the total submitters want us to provide support for the Arts Centre. The primary focus, though, was around the retention of the Arts Centre and protecting that and ensuring its future. They didn't provide much feedback on the mechanism to do that. The focus was around that centre still being here and providing that value that it brings to the community in the future. Many of those submitters talked about the programs that the Arts Centre provides and the communities that it supports and fosters and the value that they place on that. In some cases, the submissions were entirely sentimental around fond memories associated with the Arts Centre. Could be an important milestone that they've experienced there, like a wedding, or a memory of attending a show or concert, or attending university there. And those calls for support tended to be quite emotional ones. The community aspect of the Arts Centre was raised by a lot of submitters who spoke of the centre's ability to bring people together and foster community. And again, it's the importance of the space for the arts community. So much like our facilities, it's a place for people to gather, to make connections and to build community. And there really was a desire from the submitters who spoke about the Arts Centre to see its future protected. And that was the focus and the priority. The mechanism didn't come up particularly often in the submissions. In terms of Arana Park, 997 submitters talked to us about Arana Park, and 98% wanted the council to provide support. Submitters voiced a view that it's a critical asset for the city in terms of tourism and conservation and education, and urged us to protect that work and the animals that Arana Park cares for. Much like the Arts Centre, a lot of the submissions were sentimental, and people spoke of fond memories of visiting Arana Park when they were children and a desire to take their children and grandchildren there one day and make those memories with them as well. In some instances, submitters talked about the economic and educational value Arana brings to the city, with specific mentions of contributions to tourism, conservation breeding programs, and wildlife advocacy. So they're doing much more than what you see at face value was raised by those submitters. And regardless of why they were submitting, they were united in their desire for us to provide additional support for the park and to ensure its ongoing sustainability and continued positive impact on the community. Other contestable funds. So we received 50 submissions. 50 submitters provided feedback on other contestable funds, and the majority of these were the organisations that benefit from these funds, and the biodiversity and the sustainability funds were the primary focus. So 63% of all of the submitters who commented on this provided alternative ideas and proposals, and generally requested that we at least reinstate the funds to where they're currently at, or even increase it in some instances. In general, the feedback indicated that we aren't prioritising or doing enough to support biodiversity and ecological restoration within the LTP. So they highlighted the importance of that work and the importance of work that the organisations do in supporting that. They were disappointed to see that cuts to the funding that supports those activities had been proposed. The group spoke of the work that the funding enables them to do, and again, we spoke about the volunteer hours before, and a lot of that was reflected in the submissions from these groups as well. And the other thing they spoke about was the gains that would be lost if the funding was essentially cut. So where they've made progress using previous council funding, those gains would be lost, and it would require more funding to get back to that position again. The other one I will briefly mention here is Spring Canterbury Grant, which was raised by quite a few submitters as well. And they were urging us to make sure that that provision was there for that grant to continue in the LTP. And as I mentioned before, they raised the economic benefits and highlighted that they far outweigh the investment made by the council through that grant. And just before we move on to capital, we got quite a few submissions this year that talked about the safer streets and neighbourhoods work in the transport space. And again, this was the tale of two halves. So some submitters felt that it's wasteful spending, which ultimately is making it harder to get around the city. And if we wanted to cut some spending somewhere, we could look at that spending. On the other hand, you had a whole bunch of submitters who really value that work and highlighted the importance that it makes in terms of making our streets safe for everyone to use. And they requested that we continue to invest in this work, or even in some cases invest more in projects that support safer streets. A lot of the feedback on specific aspects of this was schools, so making it safer for kids to get to school and supporting that work. Capital. So again, we asked, are we prioritising the right things within our capital spending? And 38% of submitters told us yes, 43% said no, and 18% didn't know. Of the 443 general comments we got on the capital program, 56% of them were submitters suggesting changes. So it's not wholesale changes, it's very specific targeted things that each of the individual submitters talked about, but there was a lot of them. Those suggested changes included focusing more on specific services. Transport and Three Waters were probably the big ones there. Focusing on looking after what we've got before we add anything new or start another major capital project. Pausing all of the new capital projects until there's less pressure on the city's finances, or removing projects and programs that they don't consider to be worthwhile. And obviously that is very, one person's nice to have is another person's must have. So, in terms of feedback on transport, this is one that really does reinforce that one person's nice to have is another person's must have, and highlights the challenges around grappling with those different views and reaching a position somewhere in the middle. For many, improving transport choice was a focus. For others, aspects of the capital program represent an easy place to make savings and reduce costs. Many submitters agreed that, and this was one thing that they actually did often agree on, that we should explore different ways of doing things, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. And as I mentioned before, there was a lot of mention of the basics, but not much consensus on what those are. Cycling infrastructure. So this was the big one for transport this year. 906 submitters provided written feedback. 22% supported our proposed investment, 33% opposed, and 39% provided other suggestions. On the right there in the table, you can see that other comments has been broken down. So 40% of those other comments were submitters telling us to spend more. 21% were submitters telling us to spend less. 27% were submitters asking us to accelerate work. 6% were submitters asking us to pause work, and then there was just a few comments left over at the end there, which is your last 7%. Most submitters did provide other suggestions, and they tended to be around investing more or accelerating work on cycling infrastructure, and that was both the major cycleways but also the local cycle connections that connect people to those big cycleways. Submitters on this one tended to, so those who supported and those who provided, many of those who provided alternatives, spoke of the importance of transport choice a lot and highlighted how important providing this infrastructure is in providing transport choice. And in some cases, both from submitters who supported our proposed investment or opposed, they suggested that perhaps we should look at alternative ways of delivering some of our cycleways and whether there could be more cost-effective or pragmatic approaches in some instances that we could take or explore. So that was an interesting little crossover from submitters who are often divided, where they actually came together and said the same thing. On the other hand, some submitters thought that we should scale back and further delay cycling infrastructure to try and reduce costs. They weren't saying never, but they were saying maybe we could do it a bit later. But on the other hand, that was outweighed by people who wanted us to bring some of that work forward. So the cycling infrastructure landscape in terms of submitter feedback was quite complex for this LTP. There were some things that they did agree on, which is around exploring different ways to do things, but we still got the same two sides of the tail that we tend to see most years. Public transport. Often submissions on public transport infrastructure went hand in hand with those on cycling infrastructure, and it comes back to those submitters focusing on transport choice. So it wasn't around different modes, it was around ensuring that people have choice in how they travel. So 371 submitters provided feedback on this. 33% supported our proposed investment, 8 opposed, and 48% made other suggestions. So again, that's a very big chunk of people saying other. 70% of those other suggestions were people suggesting that we spend more. 6% were suggesting that we spend less. 3% wanted us to accelerate some of the work that we've planned, and 2% said pause, and then you've got 20% at the bottom, which are the remaining comments on that one. Submitters acknowledged that there's the need to make public transport more accessible, quicker and easier to use if we want more people to use it, and really highlighted its importance as part of that transport choice picture. The focus was on accelerating work on PT infrastructure, ensuring planned work has still progressed despite changing central government priorities, or providing services in areas where there are currently gaps in the network. The Southwest was mentioned quite a lot in that instance. Those who opposed tended to fall into two camps. They either thought that we're spending too much on roads and not enough on public or active transport, or they thought the opposite of that, and that's that we were spending too much on public transport and it was a waste of money because public transport is underutilised. And finally, roads. So 458 submitters this year provided feedback on our proposed investment in roads. 14% supported what we're proposing to do, 30% opposed, and 45% made other suggestions. So again, a really big chunk making other suggestions. And this comes back to what I said at the start around, have we got the balance right? Almost, but there are some changes that we need to make. So in terms of the other comments on roads, 34% were submitters asking us to spend more, 18% were submitters asking us to spend less, 7% were submitters asking us to accelerate some of the work, and 4% were asking us to pause some of the work. And then you've got a big chunk at the bottom there, which is 37%, which were just the remaining comments in that category. So those who made other suggestions tended to have opinions at two very opposite ends of the spectrum. Those who think that the balance is out as we are placing too much priority on investing in roads and not enough on investing in active and public transport. And then on the other hand, those who think the balance is tipped too far in the active and public transport direction and that we should be investing more in our roads. In many instances, submitters highlighted issues with roads in specific parts of the city. The east was commonly brought up, as well as the southwest sometimes. And prioritising work on the Pages Road Bridge was raised by many submitters who reinforced its importance as a lifeline connection for those who live in New Brighton and the wider east. Three Waters. So a lot of the feedback that we received on Three Waters this year was focused around chlorine and getting chlorine out of the water. And the message really was clear, just do what you need to do to get us back to how our water used to be. So submitters expressed a strong desire to see us do the work required to get chlorine removed from our water, and that is consistent with what we see in the residents' survey each year as well. Chlorine remains one of the key issues that people raise in that survey. A smaller cohort also commented on fluoride and don't want to see this added to our water. The other thing that came up in the Three Waters submissions was less around the work that we were proposing to do, and you can see the note at the bottom there that the term Three Waters has almost become a problem and it's suffering from a bit of an identity issue. So there were quite a few submitters who said, why are we investing in Three Waters at all when the current government has repealed the previous government's water reform legislation? So the fact that that previous legislation was called the Three Waters legislation has left us with a little bit of issue around people are confused about why we're investing in Three Waters, and their view of that very much aligns with that previous reform approach. Sports fields. The sports field network plan and sports grounds, again, we received a large number of submissions on this, 401 across the sports field network plan and the other sports fields and sports grounds categories. 57% of those were pro forma submissions on the sports field network plan. Football players and clubs had a strong presence among the submissions on this issue, and you probably heard that last week as well. They requested, in terms of the sports field network plan specifically, that we bring forward the 85.6 million set aside towards the end of the 10-year period of the LTP, enabling investment in establishing floodlit artificial playing turfs and improving grass facilities. And again, this came through quite clearly in the hearings, that the state of the current grass turfs is having an impact on accessibility and playing time, and in some instances is causing health and safety issues. So they are very keen for us to prioritise that investment and bring it forward. In other instances, they noted that the current facilities were limiting development opportunities for players as well. It's also worth noting that we got a few submissions once again on the new court for canoe polo, which was a significant theme from last year's annual plan, so that one carried through with a few submissions on that this year. And again, you heard about that in the hearings too. Tree canopy. So 134 submitters provided feedback on our proposed spending on the tree canopy. More than half supported that investment, and it was, again, the environmental side was important. So they're important from an environmental point of view, and they will help with the impacts of climate change. But also they provide really great benefits in terms of the look and feel of our neighbourhoods and the impact that they have on the livability of the city. So that's a focus for people, the kind of city that they want to live in. Alternatives raised included accelerating the work, so we've heard that before as well, focusing on planting natives and regenerative forests, and increasing the tree canopy in specific areas of the city. Some submitters raised recovery from the Port Hills fire and urged us to use native plants in that work as they'll be more resilient. Right, out of capital. On to event bid funding. So this again was a specific question that we asked submitters, and you can see on the right there the results of that question. So 69% told us no, leave the event bid funding at its current levels, and 31% told us that they wanted to increase that event bid funding. In terms of the reasons for that, for those who want to leave it, they told us that now's not the time. Households are under financial pressure, and this is a nice to have when many people are struggling to pay for the must-haves. In quite a few cases, they also said that we won't be able to afford to go to any of the events that we're going to be funding the bidding for. So that's a little bit of an irony there. And then on the other hand, you've got those who think that we've invested in the facilities now and we need to attract the events to fill those facilities and make the most of them. 738 submitters made comments on this one. 40% suggested alternatives, which tended to fit into two primary categories: reducing the amount allocated to bid funding or removing it from the LTP completely, or shifting the onus of funding any additional event bid funding away from the ratepayer, and instead suggesting that those who will benefit the most from that additional funding should contribute more. Little note at the bottom there, those aged 34 years and under were more likely to say that we should increase the event bid funding, and that again comes down to the type of city that those young people want to live in. The climate change proposals. So there were two separate questions that we asked about this. Again, they were multi-choice questions. Should we bring forward the $1.8 million for accelerating adaptation, and should we create a climate fund? This table's split into two pieces. The reason for that is the School Strike for Climate form slightly tweaked the submission, questions that we had in our form, so we've treated them in exactly the same way as we have in the past and just separated them out so that that's clear. Overall, 53% supported bringing forward that $1.8 million to accelerate adaptation, and 59% said yes, go forward and create a climate fund. So there was support for both of those proposals. And when submitters spoke about it, they talked about both of them and climate change and adaptation as a whole. So that's what we've done here. We've pulled it together. Much of the feedback urged council to take climate change and climate risks seriously and do more to support mitigation, adaptation, and prepare us for what the future may bring. There was a strong push from submitters for the council to prioritise climate change mitigation in our long-term planning. Include investments in biodiversity, including investments in biodiversity, climate adaptation, and sustainable infrastructure. So often the biodiversity and sustainability piece went hand in hand with supporting the climate proposals. Submitters felt that we should focus on spending now to prepare rather than dealing with costly damage to our infrastructure and communities in the future. And many young submitters emphasised the importance of community engagement and taking our residents and communities on a journey with us. They felt that we could do more to ensure that young people are included in the decision-making process, as this is likely to have a pretty profound impact on their future in particular. In many instances, feedback on public transport and active transport and more intensive development also went hand in hand with responding to climate change. So there was some strong links throughout submissions from submitters on biodiversity, climate change, transport. And finally, before I hand over to Ashley, we also asked submitters whether there are any areas that they thought we could find additional savings or efficiencies. 332 submitters provided us with feedback on this question. And in many instances, submitters told us that our spending was wasteful and that we should cut our costs and focus on the basics. But when responding to this question, they also found it hard to pinpoint specific examples, and I think that reflects the challenge that the council has as well. Where submitters did provide feedback on specific areas, they often overlapped with projects and programs, funding or services that other submitters have told us are very important. Again, reinforcing that message that one person's nice to have is another person's must have, and the challenge is to balance those opinions. Specific examples commonly mentioned, though, included climate change work, cycleways, staff costs, takaha, events, and further cuts to community funding and service cuts. And just before we get to questions, I'm going to hand over to Ashley, who's going to run you through a more localised view of what some of the submitters told us.
And give Amy a good break. So what did our submitters in the community boards and our community boards tell us? So the key themes commonly mentioned in submissions were identified for each community board. So for Banks Peninsula, there was a strong support by many submitters for investment in climate change and acceleration, with a sense that Banks Peninsula communities were particularly vulnerable to climate change. This aligned with the community board submission. Biodiversity funding was supported by Banks Peninsula submitters, but there were concerns that this funding was insufficient, with a desire for increased council resourcing. Again, this was supported by the community board submission. The renewal of Akaroa Wharf was a contentious subject, with some submitters believing the cost is too high, while others supported the investment. The Governor's Bay community are seeking funds to reduce the balance of the community loan regarding the jetty repair. Another contentious subject was the SailGP event. There was mixed support, with some citing the wider economic and social benefits of the event, while others were against it, largely due to the cost and impact on marine life. There was general support for the stormwater spend for erosion and sediment projects. There is ongoing concern about the Akaroa Harbour wastewater project, with many highlighting the risk of sediment and contaminant flow into streams, harbours. Submitters requested greater funding for civil defence and emergency management on the peninsula due to the isolated nature of communities. And finally, other points raised by the community board related to three waters, parks and green spaces, roading, heritage, and requests for additional funding. Moving on to coastal Burwood Linwood. Submitters reiterated the impact of the wastewater treatment plant on the Bromley community, and there was support for work to be carried out without delay. This sentiment was echoed by the board. There was widespread support for the Pages Road Bridge renewal, with many recognising the bridge as an essential access route for the community. The renewal was also highlighted as a priority for the board. The New Brighton Mall upgrade was seen to be long overdue, with submitters strongly supporting this project. The board was also noted this as a priority. Submitters were generally supportive of the South Shore Estuary Edge, although some suggested the timelines should be brought forward due to ongoing erosion. The board noted this as a priority as well. The Otakaru Avon cycle routes were generally supported, with a small number opposing. Some submitters also highlighted the east as poorly served by the cycle network. There was general support for adapting and accelerating climate change resilience measures. This was particularly so due to the community's proximity to the coast. Coastal hazards adaptation and emergency response planning was noted as being urgent. There were many submissions about the future use of the red zone land, especially around planting natives or as a food producing area. And the safety improvements at Albans, Ensaws Ferry and Albans Buckley's Linwood intersections were strongly supported. Other safety and pedestrian improvements near schools were suggested and supported. This aligns with the board's support for the transport safety improvements. There there continues to be perceptions that the east is neglected by council in terms of maintenance and repairs, particularly in relation to roads and earthquake repairs. Submitters would like to see biodiversity and ecological restoration adequately resourced. In terms of other priorities for the board, the funding for the Marshland Hall Trust Community Facility business case was supported by the board. Other points made by the board included support for the vacant land differential in New Brighton, support for the upgrade to the tsunami warning system, request for the increased maintenance of commercial centres, and support for the stormwater and flood management programs. Fendalton Waimari Harewood. So the Wheels to Wings cycleway remains a divisive issue for the community due to the cost and its potential impact on other road users, local residents and businesses. Some submitters were completely opposed to the cycleway, while others offered alternative designs or routes. There was some concern from submitters about the removal of the Sawyers Arms, Greers, Northcote Road intersection improvements, as it is viewed as a dangerous and dysfunctional intersection. This was also noted as a concern from the Community Board submission, along with 13 other transport projects within the board area. Traffic lights for the Harewood Breens Gardners intersection continues to be requested from submitters, and submitters requested funding for the Numweek Park upgrades, noting that sufficient sports fields and pitches or surfaces are lacking in the northwest. Some submitters would like to see this memorial cycleway brought forward and completed by 2025 due to the ongoing safety concerns. There was an overwhelming support from submitters for the council to provide ongoing funding for Orana Park, as it is considered a key asset and attraction for the city. The Community Board provided suggestions for cost savings and efficiencies, including a staged approach to the capital program, reviewing levels of service and the disposal of surplus properties. The board expressed concern about the lack of detail about how the Climate Change Fund would operate, suggesting a separate consultation and deliberation process. In a similar vein, the board raised concerns about accelerating the coastal adaptation planning program and balancing the immediate needs of residents. The board was also concerned about the lack of maintenance budgets for some council-owned assets, for instance, sculptures in Northwood. Halswell Hornby Riccarton. There was general support for the proposed organics processing plant, although there were some concerns about the containment of offensive odours. Submitters generally supported the Clyde, Riccarton and Wharenui intersection safety improvements. There were some requests by submitters for the Sockburn roundabout intersection safety improvement to be reinstated. There was general support for the cycleway projects within the board area, with some requesting that these be completed earlier. Others noted that there were some cycleway projects included in previous LTPs that have been omitted in this draft LTP. The gifting of the Yaldhurst Memorial Hall was widely supported by submitters, although some noted concerns about the ability of the Residents Association to fund and operate the hall. Submitters strongly supported a new dog park in Halswell, with some asking for it to be brought forward. This was also supported by the Community Board. The Community Board requested the improvement of intersections to be brought forward and is seeking additional funding for footpaths. A priority for the board was the revitalisation of Sockburn Park. The board also requested the refurbishment of Wharenui Pool due to the Parakiore delays and the population growth in the area. The board noted the rates increase should be less than 10% and did have some saving suggestions. Moving on to Papanui Inner Central. Submitters expressed frustrations with the transport issues in the central city. These issues included the lighting phasing, speed restrictions and cycleways. Some submitters think the council was intentionally making it difficult to travel in the central city and now avoid the central city because of these frustrations. Submitters were against pausing the Te Aratai cycle connection, noting the area needs to be safer and affordable travel options should be made available. The congestion, design and safety aspects of Cranford Street were identified as issues by some submitters, particularly where buses, cyclists and children using the road was concerned. There were also requests for Flockton Street to be improved to counter the downstream effects of the Northern Motorway. The Community Board also noted the support of the Northern Corridor Downstream Effects Management Plan. Submitters addressed concerns about the running costs, noise and transport issues relating to Te Kaha, with some seeking a pause on changes to its surrounding streets. Views were mixed when it came to the Park Terrace cycleway. Some submitters thought this had a negative effect on the flow of traffic, while other submitters saw the outcomes as positive and suggested this be used as a template for future cycleway projects. There was overwhelming support for the funding of Arts Centre. The board supported various projects in the LTP, including the Phillipstown Community Hub, Papanui Youth Facility, and the funding of grants and development that support the board's priorities. The board mentioned a few transport matters, noting that the LTP seems to be retreating from previous transport and cycleway commitments and requesting that Wheels to Wings proceeds as previously promised. The board is concerned about the removal of Greer's, Northcote and Sawyer's Arms intersection, as was the Fendleton Waimari Harewood board. Other projects the board supports includes the Greer's Langdon's traffic light installation, surface flooding reduction program and the Central City Shuttle. And climate change remains a top priority for the board, and it supports the advanced investment for adaptation. Finally, what did Spraid and Cashmere Heathcote have to say? So the traffic calming and safety improvement measures received mixed views, with some submitters telling us that these traffic calming measures were unnecessary and costly. The board expressed their support for safer speed plans, especially near schools. The South Library rebuild had mixed reviews, with some supporting while others thought the spend unnecessary or it could be delayed. The board supported the South Library rebuild but requested additional funding for the temporary facility and other services. Some submitters thought the pines on the Port Hills should be replaced with natives or fire-resistant plants. The board supports the Port Hills plans and would like input into the development of the plan, as well as future funding for active land management to reduce fire risk. Several submitters supported the spend on biodiversity and flood management, although concerns remain about the impact of residential development on the hill and silt entering waterways. Many submitters would like to see the completion of the Opawaho River route cycleway brought forward. This was also supported by the Community Board. Additional points the board made included a request for sufficient funding towards pest management, strongly supporting the urban forest plan. Parks and facilities were a top priority for the board, and the board was concerned about the reduction of levels of service for land drainage. The board would also like to see the 3 major cycle routes reinstated. The board supports the Selwyn Street Master Plan, and the board would like to see the retention of 32 Hillier Place, which is a red zone property.
And that's us for another year.
Questions? This is going to be good. Tyler started reading where it started. Then Yanni, please.
Yes, got in. Kia ora, guys.
Hello.
Firstly, thank you so much for all of the work you've done. This is amazing. So comprehensive, easy to read, and it gives us a good breakdown on everything. I've got a couple of questions, and the first one is talking about that comprehensive breakdown. You've given us a really good one. I'm wondering if we're able to access the raw data to make it easier for us to go through the 7,000. It's only for example, the demographics you were talking about within that report, which is, personally, me, I'm after the 35 and under block.
Yep.
Obviously with youth portfolio. And also the ward by ward breakdown. So
Yes.
for example, Riccarton, Hornby, Horsell.
So the ward by ward breakdown, we had to do a little bit differently this year to how we normally would, time. And that's why Ashley's just run you through it. So we have a little thematic for that, which is attached to the back, and that has required one of us to go through manually and look for those
Got
bits.
you.
So
Oh, I
there's
see.
no more detail sitting.
But you don't
underneath
have it on hand. No, okay, that's fine.
In terms of the raw data, again, that's a harder one. Those tables in the report are essentially your raw data, and then I've had to export some other reports out of Consult, our piece of software that does that. So, I mean, those are there, but what is in the report is essentially
What's in the
more as
report?
we can
That's
get the
cool.
data.
That's fine. We'll just do some reading.
Yeah.
It's our job. The next one is based on the submissions that we had. actually, Phil's footpath crew got a shout out in terms of the diversity and moving within pilot programs. In your view, within those submissions, do you think the submitters asking to explore different ways of doing things would mandate these pilot programs being implemented for different units?
I think so, and a lot of what we didn't get as many submissions on footpaths as we would normally get, and that is, I suspect, because there are a lot less issues out there than there were previously. So that was one thing that was noticeable this year. Footpaths is normally right up there in terms of the submissions on the annual plans and the LTP, and they just weren't one of those main transport topics this year.
Cool. So that would sort of help mandate us to think differently and provide maybe some different ideas.
The other thing that came through on that note is around cycleways, and a lot of people highlighted the Park Terrace one as a good example of where we've done something differently and it's worked quite well, and whether we can do more of that. And I mean, you had in the hearings Michael Patterson talking to you about Memorial Ave, and that's another example of where people are saying, this infrastructure is good, but are there other ways that we can do this that are different where it's appropriate? In some places it might not be, but if we can, they were saying you should be exploring that.
Yeah. And the last question is around the feedback. So we've received quite similar feedback to the annual plan. A lot of it is sort of 50-50.
Yep.
And you did talk about the benefits of having specific projects being asked for. Would you find benefit in the next year's annual plan actually providing more specific projects for them to talk on to make it easier for us?
So the closed questions and the way we ask the questions is really helpful, because it helps us quantify things a little more and it makes quantifying them easy, but it also keeps submitters focused on some of those issues that we really want feedback from them on. So the way we ask the questions is very important, and that has worked very well this year. So it was very easy for us to say, here are some of our big issues, we're going to ask specific questions on that, and we had good quantifiable feedback from submitters on some of those.
In terms of those big projects like the capital and operational side of things for funding proposals for Orana Park and things, is that enough, or could we actually add a few more going into the future plans?
I wouldn't. It's the right balance. So if you add too many questions, you'll lose people, and we'll always get those big things that come up that we don't expect to come up, and that's why we haven't asked questions on them. So it really is a balance, and it's around balancing a good way for us to manage feedback and focus submitters, but also providing them with opportunities for them to tell us whatever we want. So it's just that right.
It's good to know. Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks, team. Appreciate it.
Yanni, please.
Yeah, again, just to endorse the comments. Thanks for all the comprehensive report back. It is really good to get this information. I just one concern in particular is around the sports network plan, which I know the clubs had access to, but the public and the wider community did not. And I'm just wondering how much we can take into a group of people knowing what's in the plan, being able to make submissions when the community and the public actually didn't know what's in it and weren't given that opportunity.
So we also received, I think there was 88 submitters who commented on sports fields and parks in general, and that wasn't about bringing the funding forward. So the sports field network one, again, was another issue that we didn't see coming, and it popped up as a pro forma, which is where we get usually set text that comes through, and that had been distributed far and wide through organisations, and those submissions came from both the clubs and people in the clubs and people involved. So beyond that, I can't comment too much on that, but we did get other feedback that went alongside that on sports fields and facilities as well. So that wasn't specifically addressing bringing that funding forward, but they were talking about those facilities and the need to improve them.
So when I look at what you've got written in the text around sports parks, it says, we received many submissions urging us to bring forward proposed investment, 313 provided things, provide feedback on the funding for it, around the staging of the funding. And it kind of, I don't know, it kind of supports it, but then when I go to the table that you've got with the raw data, it's kind of trickier. It's got 20% were opposed to it. So more people were opposed to it than supported it. So that's on page of the attachment. Sorry, there's no page number, but it's in the
big table.
It's in the big table. If I go to Parks and I go to, for example, Sports Network Plan, 20% opposed, only 11% support. So I'm trying to get my head around how I align what the feedback is around positive and negative and what that means, because it's quite hard to tell from the table.
I've got the headings around the wrong way.
Right.
That's me. I can sort that. So ignore that.
Okay.
I think I have.
Maybe
I will double check that.
Okay.
But the main thing to understand is with the Sports Field Network Plan, because they were asking us to do something different, the bulk of those submissions have been coded to other.
Okay, so just like you've done with the other ones, because there's quite a few where you've got the kind of high-level analysis and you've got a kind of breakdown of the submissions, but in the sports one, we don't have that. Are you able just to do a little bit more around?
So that is
helping
in
us
that
understand
table
it?
in the back. There was 313 on the Sports Field Network Plan, and 53% of those were general comments or other. So there's a lot of feedback, and we just need to. I will check the headings.
Yeah, cool.
But
So
it is there.
like you've done, sorry, just to show you, like you've done with roads, so you've got that table, but if I go to sports, there's no table. So
No.
would it be okay just to get some additional information around like a table?
We'll see what we can do. But if you go and read the Sports Field Network one submission with the set text, that essentially sums up what most of them said.
Yeah.
So a lot of the feedback on that Sports Field Network Plan was set text, and it was used widely.
But from the verbal submissions we had, a number, not the sports clubs, but a number of people said that that was where they thought we were overspending and that should be cut.
The wider written feedback doesn't reflect that,
Okay.
is what I would say.
Yeah.
Yanni,
Okay. And just the only other question I had was around,
this is the last question.
yeah, last one, like Tyler's last three. Yeah, no worries. Like where people have specified a certain street or a certain request, like I know we've got kind of the big numbers, but things like Wine Street or things like the request around the skate park, how are there things that we've identified sort of, I guess, bespoke, unique, like you mentioned water polo?
Less so this year, and that purely comes down to timing. So where we would normally do some more of that, we just haven't had the time to do that analysis this year. So it's there, and that's why you've got that big report that is about 5,000 pages long that has all of the submission points broken down by topic for you.
Yeah.
And that enables you to go in there and look by topic what submitters have said. So where we would normally do some of that for you, we just haven't had the time.
Right. So if we wanted a list of
Great
streets-
answer. Come on, mate.
No, just on that one. If we wanted like a list of streets that people have asked for to be renewed, how do we get that?
So that will need to come out of those submissions, but that will
Do we
require
read through
someone to.
and we?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah, please.
Something that actually hasn't popped up on here, and it's just it might be great news, which is really good. So previously, in previous LTPs and annual plans, we've had a number of submissions that have said that how we have engaged on the long-term plan hasn't been as useful as it could have been, and we haven't seen that coming through in the thematic analysis this time. What have people said about how we've engaged on the long-term plan?
So there was a little bit of that, and again, it's in the back of that 5,000 page report. It's one of the last topics, and the table of contents will take you there. But it was mixed, and there were some people that were really happy, and there were some people who didn't like. Usually it wasn't the entire way we engaged, but it was specific elements of the stuff that we had provided that they had issues with.
Yeah. So I think a couple of the people who came and spoke to us in the hearings were specific around the fact that we were saying how much money we were spending, but we didn't say what the change was from previous or actually how much work that enables.
So there was a little bit, and I'm just looking at it now, of the 7,000 submitters, there was 153 comments on that. So
that's not bad, eh?
It wasn't a huge amount.
Yeah, because in the past it's been quite big. Thanks.
Okay, Victoria, then Kelly, and then that's about it.
Thanks. My first one is actually just going to be a supplementary to Councillor Templeton's there, in relation to the 153 comments about, how we're doing it, I don't draw the same confidence from that in terms of that being an alarming statistic or a low statistic, simply because of the 7,000. We've had sort of 4,000 solely on arts. Sorry, that was a thought, it wasn't a question, so I'll go back to my questions. The first one's around the 61% that are not stated on the ward or the address, and then when you go and define the double asterisks at the bottom of your page, interestingly it says those who provided only a street name or suburb. Surely a street name or suburb ought to be able to give you some identification as to which ward they're in. Because I'm bothered by the 61%.
Use that. So they are, that little asterisk there is basically saying that this year, because again, time, we haven't had the chance to do the geocoding that we would normally do down to the level. So we've used either the street or the suburb that submitters have provided and grouped them up that way. But those 4,300 we just didn't have any information for. So we've done it where we can for who we have, but in some instances we just don't have the information to do it, and that's not a required field to make a submission.
So I understand that, but I think including the reference those who provided only a street name or suburb as not stated, then I would have thought that that was incorrect, because where they've given you a street name or a suburb, you've encapsulated it into a ward.
So
is there more work to do in that space?
The only ones that haven't been coded are the ones into wards where we have the information, are the ones that are PO boxes, or the ones that we don't have any information for. So everyone else has been coded up.
Yep. So, sorry to be pedantic about it, but that therefore means that the double asterisk definition that you've got at the bottom there is probably incorrect.
Out of there.
That's just the lawyer in me. Are you bothered by the 61% that aren't stating where they're coming from? Does that raise any concerns for you about the efficacy of the data?
It is a lot, but unless we require people to answer that to make a submission, we're always going to have that challenge. So, I mean, you can see where we've got information about where people weren't from in Christchurch. We've provided that, but there are probably more in there as well. But in the same instance, there are probably more from Christchurch in there, and we just don't. There definitely are, and we just don't know where they live. They haven't told us. So it's provided to be indicative because we don't have the full set of data, and we'll never have that unless we make that question compulsory.
Thanks. The next question's in relation to Screen Canterbury. I'm sorry, I was out of the room for a bit of question time. Has a question been asked about that?
Go on.
I recall there's just a small part in the material in the report that we've got before us about Screen Canterbury, but I recall listening to a presentation from Kim Georgine, who comes in. She came in a couple of times. She was coming in from the US,
I was watching.
a local producer, and attached to one of her submissions was quite a lengthy list of people and stakeholders who were supporting the retention of the Screen Canterbury grant. And I know for a fact, because one of those was my daughter, who's in the industry, and she genuinely believed that she was submitting on the long-term plan and voicing her opposition to it being cut. So I'm interested to know how you are recording and capturing the data around those people who support the retention of the Screen grant, because it's not apparent from the information that we've got. And is it just one submission?
It is just one, so it's a one-to-one, and if it comes in with a bunch of names on the end, it is treated as one. So this is a challenge that we have almost every year with something where we get a petition or people making submissions that a lot of people have signed. Sam's frowning at me. And that we just do, we deal with them as one submission. So I mean, that's a good message for people out there in the community as well. You're better to put in a submission and just attach the same thing.
I appreciate that it is what it is, but I think we need to adapt what we're doing in terms of our reporting to at least acknowledge and recognise that there are people that are to acknowledge that there are people who think that they're submitting and would like to have their voice heard. So I'd like to be able to see something about that in the report somewhere, please.
So yeah, that is a challenge that we have on a lot of things often, and our approach has just been to take them deal with them consistently, and maybe we need to look at how we do that. But
yeah, I'm concerned about that.
You, Kelly?
Yeah, just a simple question really about the 5% of people who submitted from outside the city and indeed the country. Do we, genuine question, do we include their thoughts and why do we include their thoughts?
they're such a small percentage that overall that they don't have a huge impact on the tone of the submissions, and especially the issues that they were submitting on. So a lot of them were driven by the Arts Centre in Arana Park, and even if I'd taken them out, that overall percentage and how things washed up at the end would look almost identical. So putting them in, taking them out, it doesn't have that much impact. If it was a bigger volume, we'd probably look at doing it differently, but because it was 5% and probably a couple of hundred in 7,000, we just haven't.
I'm just curious as to why we, what do other councils do? Why do we even include it? What do other councils do?
In some instances, they could be people who live out of the city and own property in the city, and so they still have a stake in the ground, but we don't know that. So we just treat them as a submission, as we would any other submission.
At least we know where they come from, so that's cool. Thanks.
Okay. Aaron, please.
Yeah, just a clarification on all those ones that don't live anywhere. Do we know that they are from Christchurch, or could any chance that 4,000 could be from just bots?
I would say that they're definitely not bots, so we do check that they're real people.
Check
and
around bot.
There are checks and balances that we have to do that. But what we don't know is where they live, essentially. So a lot of them will be people from Christchurch, people who filled in the Arts Centre form as they were walking down Worcester Boulevard one Saturday. But a lot of them could also be from outside of Christchurch, and we just don't know.
And then the opposite to Victoria's question around people who think they've submitted because they're part of a group that submitted, but it's one submission. And it was a problem around people opposed to the cycleway one time when 1,400 signed a petition. It counted as one. The opposite, when people, do we know how many people are submitting more than once? Because they come and do their deputation, they're now I'm me, now I'm with this group, now I'm with that group. What percentage are they? And does it change the numbers much or not really?
We merge so if an individual makes more than one submission, they get merged. So each individual is one submission, but if they are also part of an organisation, then they are entitled to make a submission through them. So we treat those two submissions as two submissions, and they are two separate submissions. And to be honest, often they cover two totally separate pieces of feedback. So in my personal capacity, I want to talk about this, and in my capacity through this organisation, I also talk about this. And that's, again, we just treat them consistently. So the approach is consistent, and that is the main thing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for how much work you've put into this. Phenomenal. Okay, so no more questions, that's good. So we'll move on to, because the next one's only 20 minutes, so we'll rip straight into that, and then we're done.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. Oh, sorry, Pete.
No, away you go. I was just going to introduce Russell, so away you go. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, councillors. So just wanted to give council an update in the overall rates position with known changes that have been captured since the draft went out for publication. So here's a summary of where we're sitting, and I'll go into some of the detail that's resulted in this in future couple of slides. So that top line is where we went out for consultation. We've made the updates, and so for year one, we're sitting at 12.1 overall, 7.8 for year two, and bang on 5 and 4 for years 3 and 4. When we split the base from Te Kaha, that's the relativeness there. So for year one, 9.93 is the base and 2.17 for Te Kaha. Like I said, that's the new starting position. So how did we get to this position? Well, there was some upward pressure on budgets, so there's about 5 items there. So top line is interest costs, slight increase with widening of credit margins, which is it's a small increase, but is an increase across the term. Increase in the rates of council owned land, and also we've looked at the remissions and a slight increase there too. We've been advised the additional costs in the organic plant. The first one running as the new site is commissioned, and the second increased cost processing plant. We've been advised by EcoCentral as an extra cost there. Most of that is the trucking of the compost through to Cape Valley. The last item there is the increased in contract inflation for living wage. That's over and above the budgeted increase that we had. The asterisk is there because we're still having a close look at that to make sure that we've only captured council's liability in that particular contracts. On the upward side, I guess we'd flagged this through a number of workshops that would look closer as we got towards the end of the year in relation to rate and growth, and we've done that. So there's two parts to this. One is the overstrike in the current year, and two is where we're looking at for the next year. So up to 1.7, which is council's been higher than that before, but this is in the upper port. So impact is almost 1% extra in rates, so rates reduction by that. Lower opening debt, so therefore there's less cost flowing through. We are getting additional levy income for Ministry Environment for levies for organics and recycling coming through. Rec and Sport, they've had a closer look at some aspects in their budget, as we've all looked through the budgets, but Rec and Sport, significant move there. Increased revenue, offset partly by some costs, but overall it's a net increase in revenue to council, so therefore less rates. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we receive additional commission for collecting the rates and running the rates process for Environment Canterbury. Better off funding, we've recalculated the grants there, and there's a slight increase in the level of funding we're getting, so a small decrease in the rates requirement. And Te Kaha, rates and insurance recovery, nothing in year one, but in year two, we'll be recovering those costs from venues, Otatahi. So that's the end of the movements in the position. So before I move on to the next bit, well, there's a couple of changes in the fees and charges schedule. Happy to take any questions at this point, Mr. Mayor.
Yep, Melanie?
So this doesn't include any potential, the increased dividends we've asked for CCHL, from CCHL?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a great question. No, these are the only known changes that we've baked into the model. So we've done that. Other things, the things we've just been speaking about, the matters that we've consulted on, the increased dividends, no, they're not factored in here at all.
Okay. Victoria?
Thank you, Russell. The increased contract inflation for living wage is quite a sum at 0.26. I can't see where that asterisk is defined.
So good question. That asterisk was for me as a note to just let council know that we're still doing some work in that space. Okay.
Can you just explain that to me? I can't make sense of the explanation you've got there. Updated contract increase estimates for living wage announcement. What does that mean?
So I think in 2021, council passed a resolution to incorporate the living wage for contracts for people that work for council. And so where we have a contract, then that living wage has got to be applied where it's applicable to their staff. So then it's council's liability to make that payment. So it's an extra cost to council to satisfy that contract.
So look, I understand that. What I don't understand is how we got it so wrong, because that's quite an impact.
Well, we budgeted 4.2% in, I guess, salaries going through, and living wage is at 6.9%. So it's significantly more than what we thought it was going to be. Yep.
Alrighty.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, actual announcement of the living wage from 1 September was announced, I think, after the plan had gone out. So when we were putting the budget in, it was just an estimate of what we forecast it to be. But I also think through you, Mr Mayor, Brent was going to make a comment where you, Brent.
Oh, it was just around as an example for you, Councillor, our current Through Waters contracts with City Care. They have a clause in there related to that where things beyond their control, they can put a claim back to us, and one of those things was the living wage decision being made by council a few years ago.
Okay, thank you. Carry on.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. So there's been some changes to the fees and charges schedule, just bring to council's attention. So just updating the pricing, if you like, to He Puna Tomoana. So there's bringing in the 10 visit pass, stating what that's going to be. There was a bit of an error between the website and the schedule, but that will be made clearer in the updated schedule. The top line being removed, updating the wording in the building levy, and there was the food account levy had been omitted, putting that back in, and we'll be updating the Hagley Park's car parking, but that matter's still to become will be discussed as part of the submission consultation process. So that's all we've got in this space, Mr Mayor, pretty brief, but we just wanted to update with the new starting position so you're aware of where we're going before the process, before the next start of the process continues.
Thank you, that's very clear. Yanni, please.
A number of submitters made comment that they thought the fees and charges should be increased for events at Hagley Park. Has there been any recommendation to look at that?
Through you, Mr Mayor, not that I'm aware of.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
So just to clarify, Russell is just correcting budget things. He's not responding in these in this update to the submissions. That's what you debate,
where we're at,
and you decide.
oh,
and we
okay.
adjust.
Yeah, I just saw the Hagley Park car parking options for consideration, and obviously there's work going on that.
That's
So
why you referred to the fact that you still need to make the decision about that.
Okay.
Right, but can we flag now around that question around how much we're charging events space in Hagley Park being used for?
Do you want to put that through the system, or do you want us to note it now?
I can. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Thank you. No more questions. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Okay, thank
and
you.
You've finished it. You have finished, I assume.
Well, yeah,
We've finished. It was really just since the draft.
Get us up to speed.
Yep, on the movements. Yep.
Yep. No, that's good.
That.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. That.
Is it?
Yep. Adjourning the workshop till Wednesday. Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Thank you. I'll now adjourn the workshop till Wednesday, the 22nd of May, which we will be here from approximately 9:30. I think it might be 9 o'clock. We're just thinking, so we'll let you know.
9:15. Yeah.
Good day.